Hey class, we're kind of wrapping up week 10 where we're talking about kind of establishing our gathering and scattering times for church ministry, or large group gatherings for worship, your Sunday morning, and then your small group ministry, your scattering out for mission and growth. So I kind of want to recap a little bit. The two lectures this week really focus on building a disciple-making culture, which is really foundational for both aspects of both the gathering time for preaching and the whatever small group time your church does. And the second lecture really focused on some of the kind of whys and hows of developing and starting small groups. And so the thing we didn't cover a lot as far as lectures are concerned is the Sunday morning worship time. What does that time look like? Now, your textbook reading covered it pretty well. Your discussion board post for this week dealt with that topic. So you're still interacting with the concepts, but I kind of want to do a quick little video on kind of understanding the whole gathered scattered idea and how that relates to your Sunday worship time and then your small group gathering time. So we're talking about a church that gathers and scatters. It's really a balancing of the ministry of the church. So it's balancing the gathering time, the getting together for Sunday morning, where there is worshiping through music and preaching and giving and communion and those type of elements, alongside of scattering for mission and growth through things like small groups or Sunday school or missional communities, community groups, whatever you want to call them. And so a healthy church, I would say, balances both and emphasizes both in a pretty equal way. Oftentimes, a church will focus on the Sunday morning gathering to the extent that it kind of defines their church. The church is known for what they do on Sunday morning at 11. So they put a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of energy from the worship team, from the pastor, and from different groups and whatnot. Really put a lot of time and emphasis preparing for and running the Sunday morning worship gathering, kids ministries and nursery and greeting and parking and all kind of different things. Well, many who focus really big on the gathering time often focus a little bit less on the scattering time. So they may have Sunday school, but not a lot of emphasis is put on training their teachers. Maybe they do small groups, but only about a third to a half of the people are actually really involved in their small group ministry. So I would say the majority of churches in North America really are imbalanced. Most focus on the Sunday morning more than they focus on the small groups. Then you can actually add a third category that really fits into both of the individual disciple, and we kind of covered that in our first class on disciple making and church planting. But we often don't really focus on the individuals in our church active in the Great Commission. But for this lecture, really talking about those two, the gathering and scattering. So I think a healthy church balances both, to where there's a lot of emphasis and a good amount of time and energy put into Sunday morning, but an equal amount put into the scattering time or the small group time, whatever that looks like, whether it's Sunday school, small groups, whichever. And so a church can also be imbalanced the other way. They can focus more on those scattering times on their small group or their missional communities or whichever, to the extent where growth is happening and there's accountability and there are Bible studies, but then the Sunday morning gathering time is kind of weak, almost anemic, and you have a lot more people involved in your small groups than are involved in your worship, and the worship almost seems a little bit dead or maybe less lively. Now, I'm not here to say that either one is right or wrong, or that one is better than the other, but it's my opinion that if we balance both, we're really getting close to what I would say is a healthy church. Because you're focusing on that gathering time where we're just all together as a family worshiping God, but you're also focusing on equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. Now, in the book of Acts, as we've been journaling, we have seen many times throughout that Luke notes that the believers in there, especially in Acts 2:42-47, he says they were gathering in their homes, breaking bread, praying, studying the Bible, different things like that, and they were gathering in the synagogue or temple. And so throughout the book of Acts, you see there's this in homes and there's at the temple, in homes and at the temple. So they were gathering at the synagogue for worship. That was actually a normal worship practice week in and week out, was to go together to a synagogue or temple, listen to a sermon, a reading of the text, maybe do some music and other liturgy. And they would also, when the church gets started in Acts 2, they start gathering in homes and they start doing, meals together. They start loving each other a little more intimately together. And So we see that even in the book of Acts, the early church tried to balance these two, and they saw ministry and mission happen in both. But primarily, your Sunday morning, your worship time is really where it's almost like a celebration service. Let's bring everyone, let's bring the family together, and let's celebrate the glory of Christ. Let's celebrate the way the gospel has transformed our lives, and celebrate what our people have been doing the past week and get us ready for the next week. And then those small groups really handle what does that look like? What does it look like to be on mission, to make disciples, to apply what was exegeted in the sermon to the lives of the individuals? And I think that often happens best inside of a small group type format where there's mutual accountability, there's care, there's fellowship, and there's a lot of even really healthy pastoring that happens as your small group leaders or your Sunday school teachers are even shepherding the 10, 12, 15, 20 that they oversee as they do that underneath the pastoral leadership. And so since our two other lectures really focus on the scattering time, the going away for mission and growth from the gathering of the community, kind of want to take a few minutes to really discuss your Sunday morning. So what does it look like? So especially if you're a church plant, your Sunday morning is going to look very different each month to each month. Hopefully, so people are growing, your numbers are growing, you have more people come to Christ and be involved in the church. You have more people helping with things like maybe setup if you're a mobile church, or getting things ready for Sunday morning if you already have a property or a building. You're lining up people who have never volunteered in children's ministry to get a nursery put together and ready. So there's a lot that really happens, especially for a new church plant, on that Sunday morning. I was privileged last week to help with the setup of a mobile church in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, who are meeting in a community center. So they had a room that seats about 100 people, and they go in and they put up about 50 chairs. They put up a little projector and screen. There are musical instruments, some coffee tables and things in the back, a little information table. Had to go downstairs and set up 2 little side rooms for nursery, for different age groups for kids. And it was a good hour and a half of us being there before anything got started, of just setting up. And there were about 10 or 12 people from the church who came and did that. And so your Sunday morning, depending on your approach and your model of a church plant, all that's going to look very different. So it's really difficult to have a lecture and say, here's everything you need to do in order to, run a Sunday morning worship service, so to speak. It's difficult because there's different approaches and different ways of doing it. But some of the key things that I would recommend and really say to not neglect for sure is, when you're thinking of your space, always think of kids. Always think where you're going to put children that are in a safe place that is easily accessible to the people inside the church and not as accessible to people outside the church. It's just really a safety thing. But make sure it's a safe environment. You probably don't want your kids meeting in a community center kitchen. Butcher knives and frying pans and things are probably not the best toys for kids right now. Not even for adults either. So you want to think of kids, where your kids are going to be meeting on a Sunday morning, and who are going to be the leaders coordinating that effort. So that would be I would say a big thing is for kids, especially that 5th grade and under, even 2nd grade and under, 5th grade and under type crowd of for kids. And your kids ministry will look very, very different depending on how you're wired and your philosophy of kids ministry. But you do want to really focus on how the kids doing. You want to focus on preparation for the worship service as far as setup is concerned. Do you need to get chairs in? Are the chairs already provided? Are you going to have to put up a little bit of a stage, or is there a stage already there? How much of the musical instruments, how do they need to be arranged? Is your projector screen or on the wall? Is it a mobile one that you have to put out? Do you have your audio-visual table set up so that everything can run from the front if you are doing audio-visual type projection? Do you have like a little welcoming table for a bulletin or a worship guide? Newsletter type things, information for announcements. Do you have, if you want to do like a little coffee setup that can be out in the foyer or there in your main gathering? It really depends on your space. But always think about what the environment of the room looks like. There are many churches that meet in a theater type room for their Sunday morning gathering, whether it's an old movie theater or the auditorium of a local school. Very popular places for new churches to meet that are renting facilities. And often you may have an auditorium that seats 500 people, but you can barely get 50 to come. So there, one way that some try to kind of work through this as they haven't quite grown yet, but you really, if you get 50 people in a room that seats 500 and they're just scattered everywhere, your intimacy just goes down, your vibe, so to speak, of your worship service kind of dwindles. And so one idea is to actually set up some pipe and drape. Some black cloth drapes or something with a pipe. You can order these or you can borrow these from other churches, different things. But what some churches actually will do is they will put these drapes across the back, and they will slide it up and only leave maybe the front, 10 rows or so of the auditorium. And so when people are there, they look back, they see this curtain wall, it makes the room feel a lot smaller. It makes you feel like, oh, there's 50 of us and there's only seats for 70. Everybody's here today. This room is full. But you pull back that curtain and there's hundreds of extra seats. But visually, it makes it feel like they're in a tight place. And then as more people come in, you can slide those drapes back and open up more rows. So I've been to several churches actually that did that way. Some kind of knew about how many would be coming, and so they would go ahead and set up the drapes around the row that they knew they would kind of fill up that front space. Others really, it kind of was flexible how many were coming, and so they would move it back to kind of pack everybody in a little bit tighter, just so it kind of has that more intimate feel. So that's one way to think for setup. And you also want to honor the facilities and your rental agreement if you are renting. If you have your own sanctuary, your own building, then setup for you is a lot easier. But you also want to make sure that the place is clean and well put together and ready for Sunday morning. Another thing you want to think through is music. I love worshiping through music, though I am really bad at singing. I cannot dance, I can't sway, I can't do anything fun and emotive with my worship. But I love to sing, especially worship to God. And so you want to think, who is coordinating your music ministry? Do you have a paid worship leader? If you're a really small church, you have some lay people who are just kind of leading and overseeing that. So you want to make sure they have everything that they need for Sunday morning, and that you have communicated with them much in advance songs for Sunday, especially if you have a certain theme or topic you're covering, and say, I would love to have some songs related to God's forgiveness. We'll let the worship leader kind of pick some of those songs to really tie that in with the Sunday morning sermon and the message. So you always want to take care of your worship team and give them time Sunday mornings, especially if you're a mobile church. Give them time for band practice before the service, because a lot of times you can only have a facility for a 2 or 3 hour slot on Sunday morning, and maybe some of your band members have a garage they can practice in, or maybe another facility they can use. But a lot of times you only get those 2 to 3 hour chunk of time, and so your band may not get to practice for that Sunday until that Sunday morning, or they're practicing for the next Sunday ahead or right after. So you always want to kind of think through that your band may not have a place to meet during the week. They may have to do it early Sunday morning while everything is being set up. So that is something to consider as far as your music and how to organize your music throughout. Each church will be different. More traditional churches will have a song, and then maybe the offering, and then the announcements or a special, different things, and then kind of close with a song like an altar call type song. And so your church, especially a new church plant, you get to decide how you want to do, how many songs, what type of music, all that. One thing I will say is let your music flow from the heart of your people. Don't impose what you think good worship music is. You may get to an area that doesn't sing and enjoy the same music that you do. And so are you going to force them to like what you like, or are you going to let your context, your community, the people God's brought to your church, let them kind of determine what the sound and the beat and even some of the songs. I think that's a really beautiful thing when we let the people decide and we don't impose from what we think. Another thing you also want to consider are elements such as communion and giving the offering. So there are different ways. Some churches do communion weekly. My church here in Winston, we do communion every week, and we actually incorporate communion and tithes at the same time. So we all file down. We come down to the front. There are servers up there who break a piece of the bread. We dip it in the juice. We partake, and then we can give our offering in the basket as we're doing that. So we don't have people who passed out anything down that. This is how we chose to do it. Some churches will pass both an offering plate, and when they do communion, pass that. So there's different ways of doing it, of course. But you also you do want to think: are we going to do communion weekly? We're going to do it monthly or quarterly, yearly. I'm a big advocate for doing it weekly because I think it's a constant reminder of the gospel and how you can and often if you do it right, you can really tie in the kind of redemptive restorement elements of your sermon, your application, to the redemptive restorative elements of communion. So a lot of times you can actually tie your sermon into setting up for the communion time. And so, but you don't have to do it weekly. You can kind of choose. That's up to your church. If you want to do it monthly or quarterly, whichever. That's completely up to your leadership team to decide. And then how you do the offering. I would always recommend that you have something more than just a box in the back. Some churches have a box set up in the back, but people kind of forget. They may not always put it in. But I think either passing out an offering bucket or plate type thing is always a good idea, or some part of the service where people are coming down for like a communion thing, and that's when they give. And always consider even like an online giving kiosk. A new church here in Winston, well, they're about 4 or 5 years old now, but they have these little iPad kiosks that they have set up. You can go to the iPad and you can put in your information. You can tithe right there before you walk into the service, or even online giving. So those are things to think through as well that are kind of part of that Sunday morning time. And I would say that probably the key element in a lot of ways for your Sunday morning worship time is the time for preaching. And so in a new church plant, your preaching needs to fit your audience. You don't preach super high, lofty academic things if you're in a blue-collar town where the average grade level completed is 10th grade. You probably don't want to start using a lot of really, really big words. You want to get the point of the message, exposit the text accurately and truthfully and faithfully, but in a way that they can understand. So your preaching will have to adapt and be flexible and change depending on the community that God takes you to. You also want to decide with your church planting team if you have others, if you have several elders or pastors who are gifted in preaching and teaching, consider sharing that load. Many churches often have the one pastor is the primary preacher. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. If he's the most gifted and the best at explaining the text, go for it. But if you've got some in your church, especially a co-pastor or another elder or something who really has that gift, I think it's a really great thing when the pulpit is shared. Maybe for our church, for a long time, our lead pastor preached 3 times a month, and one of the other elders preached 1 time a month. So it just kind of gave us a little bit of diversity as far as who we're listening to and different perspectives. It also gave the pastor a little bit of break once a month to where he didn't have to worry about a sermon. He can worry about some of the other things in the church and kind of focus on that. So that's up to you and your team and who God gives you. But really focus on expositing the text well and applying it, speaking the truth of the gospel into the culture that is there in your church. Some of the books I really have found helpful for preaching is, I'm just going to look backwards on the video because it's how it's recorded, but Tim Keller's new book on preaching, Fast, is really, I highly recommend reading this book. Preaching, Communicating Faith in an Age of Skepticism. Extremely good for preaching in contemporary culture. Another one is Text-Driven Preaching, edited by Danny Akin, the president of the seminary that I went to and am still at. And it's really focusing on letting the text outline and drive your sermon. So that's really a helpful book too. And you want to be familiar with some hermeneutics type books. I have Grasping God's Word, Gospel-Centered Hermeneutics, and a few others that are just really good to get an idea of expository preaching, and even in topical preaching before you get started. And use preaching as a time to teach your people how to study the Bible. That's why I love expository preaching. You walk through a text, you're actually teaching your people how you derive the meaning of the text as you walk through it. So it's actually kind of dual thing. You're proclaiming the gospel and you're also teaching how to do it for themselves. So. And then lastly, you want to think of, are you going to do something like an altar call? Many different guys have different views on the altar call. Many have been saved from walking the aisle when the pastor gets done. Some of you who are here or do not know Jesus, the one that we just proclaimed, you can come right now and we can pray with you, we can answer your questions, we can talk. I don't personally think there's anything wrong with an altar call. Our church does not practice that. They chose not to. But we do mention after the service, please come and talk with us if you have any questions, or if you're wrestling with something in your soul, please come and talk to us. We'd love to pray for you and answer those. So we handle that outside the service. That's the last song. is that time for coming and responding to the sermon. Maybe you talk with the pastor, some of the other leaders, or someone else. So you want to decide if you want to do that or not, and to make sure you're not doing it to manipulate people. So often, as a youth pastor, I watched teens at conferences and different things we would go to, and the same teen was walking down every time. Seemed like they got saved 13 times in a year. And really, I challenged her after about the 20th time. Said, "Are you living your faith at the altar?" Because faith is lived out daily. It's lived out every time. Are you just living your faith at the altar? Is the altar call the only time that you actually get real with God? Because Christ has shattered the wall between you and God and has bridged that. He's your mediator. You can go straight to God anytime. You don't have to wait for an altar call. And for her, that kind of helped her to think through her sanctification in her life in the Spirit and in Christ throughout the week. So you want to think through if you want to do something like an altar call type thing. And last thing is we kind of close out, when you're talking about your gathering for your Sunday morning worship time, always try to include a diverse group of people from your church to be on stage or in front of people. Now, why do I say that? Well, if someone walks in and they are a younger guy, let's say they're a younger Korean guy, and they walk in and they see another younger Korean guy on stage leading in a prayer, it kind of builds some connection. If a lady walks in and she sees someone that looks kind of like her, so to speak, on stage, leading in music or leading in some other way, it kind of builds that connection. It shows that it's not just about the pastor and the other paid pastors do everything for Sunday morning. So some of the examples of ways to incorporate other people, who let different people in your church do the welcoming time. Anyone can get up and say, "Hey, we want to welcome you to our church. We're so glad that you were here. We would love to connect with you." Anyone can say that. The pastor doesn't have to say that. Excuse me. Anyone can pray. Anyone can give announcements. Anyone, if they're talented, can be part of the worship team. So I think having that diversity and a lot of different people doing a lot of different elements and just being seen, it gets people excited. It gives them a little bit of ownership for the Sunday morning time. Something that they have a role to do. Every third week, they go up and they give the closing prayer. So I really encourage you to think through incorporating a lot of different people on the stage to kind of just really show that this is our church. We are a local family, and we do things together. So that's just a few thoughts about the Sunday morning, the gathering time, in comparison to the scattering time. So whichever you do in your church plant, whichever model, approach, however you structure, really, really emphasize that we were gathering together, we are worshiping God together as a corporate body. And then we're scattering, we are worshiping God as smaller groups for mission and growth throughout the city. So hope that would be of encouragement to you.